So yeah, it feels kind of.
Yeah, I saw that.
I don't know, I mean, I learned data structures, that's like my best customer data structures. So it's like, anything that has anything to do with that, I say it.
All right. I think we'll get started here, so we give Dr. Shi, as much time as possible to wow us with all his information. Thank you all for coming. Great crowd. I was wondering, I checked the announcement to see if we were offering Bitcoin or something. I was wondering why we had such a good turnout. This is fantastic. Thank you. Today we're very privileged to have Dr. Shi give us a presentation. Many of you students, faculty know Dr. Shi, but for those of you who don't, he's an associate professor here in the Department of Computer Science. He received his PhD in computer science from Georgia Institute of Technology in 2006. He's one of the unique academicians that has industry experience. He's spent time in the research labs at Motorola, at Nokia. He's designed multiple products for NVIDIA. He's also done work for Electronic Arts in their console program. He's co-authored over 80 publications, peer-reviewed journals. His current research includes cybersecurity, applications of big data, computing for humanity, and a broad range of research topics related to blockchain. So he's funded by the National Science Foundation, Department of Homeland Security in conjunction with BTI, and NATO, and some industry funding as well. So without further ado, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Shi, for giving us a presentation today, and welcome.
Thanks so much, Kurt.
Thank you.
I do have over 100 slides. I have 1 hour, so I want also have time for questions. So and I just quickly go through, and then blockchain, right? So blockchain developers. How many blockchain developers in Texas? One of the sort of mission when trying to have more events like this is try to actually bring Texas to the map, because if you look at how many blockchain developers in the country, most in the northeast area as well as the west coast, and then Texas, we have really far behind, and so we need more sort of events that actually say what we can do with it. And so this is actually from ACM, the Korean news, and last year, end of last year. So this is blockchain developers is the fastest growing U.S. jobs. So based on statistics as well as the LinkedIn data. So okay, so why I'm doing this? So actually many years back, you can read this actually 2007. So my colleague and I were doing research related to e-cash, basically electronic cash, using some sort of technology, right? You can see that the spending, the cash bank issued e-money based on agreed conditions, and then no double spending and things like that. But at that time, 2007, the e-cash is really kind of niche, not a very sort of promising research area from both academic as well as industry, because we knew the financial institutions had no interest in anything called e-cash. But then actually we had Bitcoin, and so completely changed. So only people who actually study this actually know actually what actually happened, because as I said, the whole industry, the research around the electronic money transfer or e-cash completely kind of went nowhere, and but compared with sort of the success story of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. But this talk is more about the technology of the blockchain, not really about what coin you should buy and how actually, or the price of Bitcoin, things like that, and I'll discuss here. So, but if you read the paper, in the abstract, you can see that they're saying there's some sort of e-money without going through the financial institution, but be able to prevent double spending, leveraging a peer-to-peer network. So that's the basic concept behind blockchain. And then it says here, this ongoing chain of records. So that's where the concept of blockchain, right, comes. It's basically, it's very simple. What's a blockchain? It's a chain of records. So it's a bookkeeping or record-keeping technology. So we, right, as mankind, from the very early, with culture, history, and we know, right, record-keeping is important because you have to prove that you own these assets, right? From the very early days, using all sorts of medium to keep records, using paper, and then now we have electronic ways of recording information, and then now we have a so-called distributed ledger that for information bookkeeping. So that's important, right? So a little bit history. So the Civil War, the General Sherman actually. When the army invaded the South, and then he collected all the deed books and burned all of them, because without the bookkeeping, you couldn't prove that actually you owned the property, right? So, and then natural disasters could, right? This example here, the Haiti, just not so long ago, so actually killed a lot of civil servants, as well as the books. The land registry records are destroyed. That creates a lot of problems when during the reconstruction, right? Because you couldn't find records actually who owned the land with this property. So people say, oh, we have digital records now, right? We don't need paper, but you can make many copies. But when you start to have many copies, because it's so easy to make copies, right? All the bookkeeping is based on digital version, and then you have all those described in F words, right? So you could have fake records and false, fraudulent, and the key question here is how to maintain the quality of the data and the record keeping, and then make sure that you have trust in the data, right? Another example I just is this very recent, but it happened actually a while ago. Carbonek, the hack of the banks, whereas they stolen over €1 billion from the European banks, and I think the mastermind behind was caught in Spain. So what they did is from this Euro suspect, we started from email phishing, right? Send emails with malware, and then be able to hijack the bank employees' the computer and be able to get into their database, and then issue money transfer, and then withdraw the money from the ATM. So basically what they did is inflate the bank account of a typical user of the bank's customer, and then transfer the difference to their own account. So as a user, if you use your bank account, but you will not be able to notice, because eventually it's the same balance, and then they withdraw the money from ATMs using the money mules. So this actually bank, right? So they have professional IT administrators trained maybe cybersecurity and very well paid. You can see that there are no guarantee, right? So the records will be still can be tampered and manipulated. So the question is there a kind of ledger system or bookkeeping system that actually tamper resistant, resilient to all the cyber criminals, and does not have a single point of failure. Even we talk about insiders, right? Maybe some employees try to manipulate the database in the banks, as example. So there is a solution, right? So the solution is this distributed ledger. That's a technology behind like Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies. The concept itself is very simple, right? So you have instead of relying on a single party or entity or organization and doing the bookkeeping, you have a large number of bookkeepers or brokers. They work together to maintain this ledger. So because you have a network of brokers, bookkeepers, so the ledger becomes distributed, right? So that's why it's called a distributed ledger, and everyone has a copy of the ledger. So in such kind of system, it's very difficult to manipulate, because for anyone who tries to alter the records, be able to actually compromise or corrupt everyone in the, or most of them in this network, right, in order to cheat or have fraud. So basically the idea is to have lots of copies. And before like Bitcoin, and no one has, I mean, in computer science, we know this is possible, right? So, but no one can imagine or think that really, in reality, someone's going to do it. And so that's why no one has done that. Things like this, that's why it's going to work. And it's the same cycle works for cryptocurrencies. And now the people in industry, like enterprise, government, they think, oh yeah, there's something behind here that we can maybe also possibly leverage and apply that solve our own problems. So the fundamental behind is tamper-resistant record keeping. So how to maintain records or books that actually very secure, resilient, does not have single point of failure, and trustworthy. For that's the basic concept. And if you're familiar with computer science, it's rely on this hash function, where if you have records and you apply a hash function, you can hash the results. And then, okay, so as a little bit example, right? So they help, let's say, for law enforcement doing investigation or check the records. The question is how to make sure if you have electronic records that can be audited and cannot be tampered, and if it's logged, and then no way you can do a backdating after for events or change it. So let's assume, right, since you have a book with records like this, what you could do is apply the hash function I just showed to the records, and then you get a hash value, and then for the next one, you hash it again with the data, and then combine it with the previous hash. So, and then you can apply the same operation to the next the row of the data, so so on. What you have is hash chain. So basically, it's a chain of records protected with the hash value. So that's pretty much how the Bitcoin, the chain of transactions look like. So this kind of records, this way, right, to keep track of records, have this chain of records protected by the hash function. It's very difficult to be manipulated. So one cannot actually stick records to this chain of history, right, of the chain records. And it's very difficult to delete or change the record itself. So it's basically auditable and also immutable. Means that you can't, right, do any change after it's actually been sort of produced. So it's tamper resistant and also traceable in a case, for example, like Bitcoin as using blockchain. So you can always go back, say, oh, where does this actually come from? Because everything is reported on the chain. So that's basic. I'll go through this because it may help to understand the basic, right, the technology, in case you not very familiar with this. So it's kind of a decentralized because there is a network of bookkeepers, or brokers. They're interchangeable. So it doesn't have a single point of failure because it doesn't matter, right, that any one of them must be available or have information no one else has, and then the whole network where the distributed ledger depends on one single organization or entity. So because everyone is interchangeable, so it's very resilient against attacks or some sort of denial of service scenario. So everyone has a copy of the same ledger. So that's the case of Bitcoin, kind of a blockchain network. Okay, so if it's right in IT or computer science or the information science and the management, the MS, it's what basically actually it's kind of a multi-master database. So, but you know, right? Traditionally, if you use Oracle database or any database, it may support a multi-master kind of scenario, but very cumbersome. It's very difficult to set up, and it's very difficult to use and then manage. So, but blockchain actually is, if you look at it, right, where it's fit, it's a type of multi-master database because the if you have a network of bookkeepers, there's a way that their copy of ledger actually consistent and it can be updated at the same time all together, and no one can cheat in the system. But because there's so many copies, and there are always questions, right? So because we'll say, oh, whose copy is the official one or the final version in case there is a dispute or disagreement of the records, and because there is no single authoritative source saying, oh, this is the one that you should trust, you should use in the case of the disagreement in the records recorded. So how to make sure, right, there are no such sort of conflict. So they all rely on some kind of a consensus protocols. There are many ways of doing this. That basically there are algorithms or heuristics I just mentioned some of them. I will not go into details, but this is actually an area of research, how to achieve sort of consistency and to make sure there's an agreement about, right, the books, because there are so many copies. But if you're familiar with database, definitely, right, there are a lot of research questions behind, like scalability, as well as the overhead, and then because in the case of distributed database, you get into this eventual consistency and all other issues, right? A lot of like some open questions in the research. So they all have a way to maintain consistency. Okay, so let's get into applications. Enough for the background. Blockchain can be used in many areas because fundamentally it's a database, as I mentioned, right? If it's a database, we know database used everywhere, right? Everywhere. Potentially now you use Oracle database or MySQL or any database, you will say, oh, geez, I found out I can use blockchain, but it's not a surprise to anyone, right? So because if whatever you're doing right now use a database, there could be right a way of doing that using blockchain. So what I'll cover today is mainly related to supply chains, logistics, as well as the auditing and the compliance, the information sharing. But blockchain can be used in many other areas as well, and I'm not sure this is actually listed here, actually comprehensive, but basically can be applied almost everywhere. So, but also always the question, right? You could apply it. It doesn't mean it has some economic or business kind of advantage over what you're using right now. So that requires some very careful detailed analysis or business case study that to make sure it actually makes sense, right? So basically, it's an alternative. You can use it, but economic or as a business case, it makes sense or not. You have to study, right? What's the current actually overhead or barriers or pains that actually use Oracle database or MySQL or other alternative, right, for bookkeeping. So, okay, there are a lot of, because people realize that you can use blockchain for many applications, many industry areas. So since 2017, I think there are a lot of like the proof of concept and trials or pilots. They try to test and then say how it works. But still, I would say still in the kind of early stage, because we're still trying to figure out what's the best sort of killer apps, right? So what is the application that makes the most sense, and that's we can show that actually, oh, see, this is actually right a perfect example of blockchain that actually bring value to the users to solve their problems. So really need killer apps, and it's still early stage, and people still try different sort of ways of business models and say, oh, this makes sense. So hopefully that will have more successful stories, and people say, oh, now we have some template, right? So now you see, oh, see, if they can do that and succeed, I can do something similar. So what we don't have today is many, right, such examples where a lot of them is in the stage, let's see, we can do that, but will it work or not? You have to try, and then, right, if you succeed, actually show it actually works. And another way to look at this is blockchain is kind of a public digital infrastructure. That's actually something new. that's why actually people sometimes very excited. It's public digital infrastructure. We don't have such thing actually before because we have a cloud, but the cloud is not a public the digital infrastructure because you have to pay, right? Sure, I mean you can say I will pay for electricity, water, all those services, but the cloud is actually controlled by very few players, right? Like Amazon. In the case of blockchain, it's basically it's a public infrastructure for bookkeeping, for digital bookkeeping, and that's the case of public blockchains. And also there's consortia-based blockchains where private blockchains where a group of companies or enterprise or government they have shared interests to maintain this digital infrastructure, right? So it doesn't have to be public in the sense like Bitcoin. So it could be just a group of stakeholders. They say, oh, seems like why we have to have each one's database, and a lot of times a lot of paperwork or manual synchronization. So why not we have this kind of using this concept or technology, have a distributed database like a distributed ledger where we can work together, right, to as a way to share information to maintain the database that actually has value to them. So in that case, they can form a consortia and then they work together, right, to have this digital infrastructure. So in both ways, it's some sort of public digital infrastructure, either open to everybody in the world or it's to your partners or stakeholders. And as a sort of, it's still public to your kind of partners and stakeholders. So I still call it public blockchain, just the relative sense that closed. Okay, so because there's so many applications, the rest of the time I will just focus on logistics, supply chains, and customs. Because the BTI, right, that stands for Borders, Trade, Immigration, I think one of the major areas of interest is actually related to customs or cross-border transactions, either people or goods or money. So here for the logistics, right? So this well-known and recognized problem is lack of information flow that actually transparent or visible to all the stakeholders along the value chain. Here it says up to 50% of the cost actually moving containers, as example, actually due to paperwork. But that's based on study. That looks very kind of a high number. So if we talk about paperwork in the sort of cross-border supply chains or moving goods, cargo cross borders, you will be surprised the amount of document involved behind. Here actually show the exporters need to prepare those documents they have to fill out, and the importers need to prepare those documents, and the freight forwarders need to arrange to prepare those documents, and that's all the stakeholders involved. And then we have clearing agents also need to have some documents for the port of entry, the customs, as well as shipping lines need those documents like freight invoices and that you can see here that the arrival notification. That's basically all the sort of paperwork they have to deal with, as well as the freight shipment banks, the insurance brokers, and then if you look at to ship cargo or goods, the amount of documents, paperwork behind is actually huge and creating a lot of overhead. The problem of this is multiple versions of reality, right? So how to make sure actually each time the data get copied or duplicated, actually there are no mistake or error behind, because how do you know the information you receive as part of this whole chain, of operations, shipping goods or cargo, that actually you receive actually the same or consistent information with other copies of the same data in this whole ecosystem. So that's a great challenge because it creates multiple versions of reality, and so causing delays and then the risk of compliance. reduce visibility and then a lot of those silos of information, the data, and, as well as administration cost. So, so the people say, oh, okay, we know this problem. It's not new to us, and so how we kind of solve this? And then the blockchain perhaps have this is a technology that actually can be applied. Try to see if actually can help to address this. And as well as this is just some data statistic saying that most people, in this this whole value chain, carriers or the operators, logistic providers, the port authority shippers, they all agree that there are no actually the visibility of the data is a major problem here, and some actually even say there's basically any kind of visibility now. So this actually, I feel like this should be an issue. It's a priority. It's important. It should be addressed. So for customs, right? So the custom is only one part of this, right? So they have their own concerns, and because they are the one that actually have to authorize, right, to check all the compliance requirements, the trade laws, and then as well as security, the concerns. And so they have to make sure that the data they receive or submitted to them actually correct, right, or accurate. So they don't know because they only receive the entry data, but a lot of things happened in the supply chain that they have no sort of way to tell, and then they just have no information, right? So if the, for example, the invoice is tempered, and who actually, right, the exporter, and sure, I mean, sometimes they ask that information, the manifest, the forms that they receive, but there are no way for them to really to validate, to verify actually that that's actually correct. So why blockchain could help? Because blockchain basically, in the case of cryptocurrency, is technology used to keep track the custody of the crypto assets, right? So basically, you have a network of brokers. They work together to validate transactions and maintain this ledger. So they sort of work together to track the custody of Bitcoins, for example, or crypto assets. But in the case of supply chains or other areas of application, what you could use is apply blockchain to keep track the flows of documents, information, as well as physical goods, cargo, or financial transactions, but not like crypto assets. It could be just like banks and the real financial assets like the stocks or other type of the financial instrument with value. So so that basically using blockchain to monitor and manage the flow of the assets. So that's the idea, right? So why it can be applied, and people always ask questions, right? Why this is different from the way I'm doing right now? And so if you deal with a scenario where you have a large number of stakeholders, everyone has some information, but no one has the whole information. So why not I create this centralized, right, kind of database where I ask everyone to submit their data, and then now it's solved. This actually concept not new, and it has been tried several times in the past, but never worked because whenever you heard some companies say, "Oh, we just created this freight database, centralized, every freight forwarder in the world will share information to us, put it in our database." I mean, it sounds like great if that can be done, but actually people tried and never ever succeeded, and then we know it actually doesn't work. It's not like the idea itself has a problem. It's just it doesn't work. And so we know that we deal with this distributed environment with multiple stakeholders, and then they don't have the motivation to submit the data to a centralized place. And so blockchain could be a solution because, as I said, it's actually a distributed database. It's a distributed ledger. It does not require everyone submitted the information to a centralized place and managed by a central the authority or entity. So it's basically a technology allowing you to have centralized or visibility or transparency in the supply chain or logistics or right without actually centralization. So this is actually why people think, oh, this is great, maybe we should try it, maybe it solve our problem. That's the concept behind. So I just look at some use cases, right? So one is this supply chain traceability. In this case, actually, it's very simple. The application of blockchain is kind of straightforward. Is one of the most sort of simplest one that, right? Just use blockchain as a public registry. As I said, blockchain is a public digital infrastructure, and you can use. It's a distributed database. So fundamentally, it's if you say, oh, it's a public registry, that's correct. So then why not we just use it as a public registry that can be used if all the stakeholders along the supply chain they use blockchain, so you could achieve traceability because this chain of records give you the traceability. So there are like the many companies or startups, they look into this. Perhaps at the very beginning, they don't know which industry will be the early adopters, right? So that more likely we saw what about those more expensive, valuable, or luxury goods that, for example, diamonds, right? So and to use blockchain for traceability along the value chain. Actually, one reason I think for the diamond industry, so as an early adopter or so interested in this is because the pressure from the artificial diamonds. It used to be actually easier to tell, right, which one is natural, which one is artificial, the diamond. But now because the technology is so advanced, and it's become very difficult actually to tell apart the artificial diamonds versus natural diamonds. And because of this, so they will figure out if let's say you buy the diamond, it's a natural diamond, and how you can show, right, if it becomes so, the artificial one becomes so great, good, right, in terms of quality. So traceability is important, right? If you can trace back, oh, I know this is actually, all right, it's not like artificial created in the lab, it's mine, and then I know who actually, where is mine, and then actually how's the cut, and then who's the manufacturer, and then you have the entire history, the recorded with traceability, and then hopefully it has more value, right? Otherwise, people say, why I buy this, right? So it's like virtually, it's no difference from the diamonds made in the lab. So you can see, right, why they're sort of interested in this, as well as other areas like medicine. There's some data that based on World Health Organization, the 30% of actually the medicine sold in some part of the world actually counterfeit. So that's quite a significant number. So as well as similar to the diamond case, there is because it's medicine, right? So the people died taking sort of fake or counterfeit medicine. So there are about a number actually is about 1 million people in the world. So there is a real reason to use blockchain or traceability. That's for using blockchain as a public registry. The other one is record keeping, right? So it can be used for record keeping. And as an example here, because I know our school try to have, we already, right? It's official. It's medicine, the college, as well as we have pharmaceutical, college. The FDA actually has a mandatory requirement for bookkeeping in the pharmaceutical production or development. So it's managed by the Office of Policy for Pharmaceutical Quality. So for to keep track of all the sort of how is this actually made, right? What ingredient you're using, what's the manufacture process. You need to keep logs. The files. The problem with they have is data quality, that as well as compliance. There were many cases where, right, during their inspection by the FDA, and then there's just violations how the data actually recorded, kept, and then the quality actually not very good. That's why they aggressively try to promote sort of a standard for pharmaceutical the development and the manufacture that to have sort of assured data integrity and quality. So if you remember, also have this audit trail, right? So that's basically from the FDA. This is not, I didn't make this up. So it's basically to make sure you can't delete, you can't backdating, you can't altering, and there must be compliance and overriding. But it sounds familiar, right? At the beginning, I mentioned that actually blockchain is a way of tamper-resistant bookkeeping. So if you look at this requirement from FDA, it sounds okay. So it seems like I can use blockchain here. So to make sure that the log files or the data produced when the manufacturer of the drug or pharmaceutical products actually have the quality that actually can be trusted and also can be audited. And those I mentioned using blockchain as a public registry as well as bookkeeping mechanism. Fundamentally, in the case of multiple business stakeholders or industry partners, what actually blockchain can achieve is this business process automation across stakeholder boundaries. Because if you have, using today's technology like a database, right, within your organization, you can do automation, reduce paperwork, and improve productivity, centralize management of the data. That can happen, right, within organization. But cross the boundary of the organizations will be very difficult because I have no control of the database my partner using, right? I don't know who they hire, I don't know what database they use, I don't know the code they have. And so then you find out in the case of the business, the process automation to improve efficiency, it stops at the boundary, right? So sometimes we'll say, oh, we'll sit together to have some standard, right, in terms of the data exchange. But that's only how far you can go because still you have to make sure if I have the same copy of the same data, right? The different the copy by different the stakeholders in the whole, right? The ecosystem, the supply chain. How do you make sure actually it's consistent, it's the same whenever it's changed, and then my partner's database also changes, right? Accordingly. That's very difficult, right? Because there's a lot of manual